Hey everybody, Dr. Karen here. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about categorization. So, a lot of SLPs work on categories in order to build their students' vocabulary. I wanted to talk today about a mistake that a lot of people make when teaching this skill and what you can do instead so that you get good generalization. So, what a lot of people do is that they know that their students struggle with categorization. They know that they have a hard time with word retrieval. They know that they can't define and describe words. And just that mental organization that's required for them to really learn vocabulary easily is just not there. So, categorization can be really important for that. But the problem is that a lot of activities and materials on the market, while they're not bad activities or bad materials, the way that they are, a lot of people use them is not the way that is going to get you good generalization. So a lot of times it can be tempting to just kind of drill and work on categories as a discrete skill. So for example, it's like, let's name a bunch of animals. Let's name a bunch of foods, or give your students a bunch of words and say, what category does this go in? While that activity can be effective as part of another activity, a lot of us stop there. And a lot of worksheets out there will kind of guide you through in that fashion. And the problem with that is that it ends up being very decontextualized, meaning that it's just taught out of context and it's not very functional. So that means that when a student is in another situation where they actually have to apply that skill, they don't draw that connection. And so you might not actually see functional gains in vocabulary development. The good news is that there is a way that you can teach vocabulary, or that you can teach categories in a way that actually does help your students to make those connections, that will bridge that gap between those rote drill activities and then those really hard, more functional language activities that your students have to do in school, such as reading comprehension, telling stories, writing an entire paragraph, all of those things. So we want to be able to bridge that gap, because you know that when you go from that rote drill activity to something a lot more functional, that it's really hard for your students to make that big jump. So what you want to do instead of teaching categories in isolation is teach them in a process of just teaching an entire string of semantic features for that particular word. So instead of just looking at it as one feature and answering that one question, you're going to talk about a whole bunch of different things about a word. And this is called semantic feature analysis. For example, if I were to describe a dog, I would want to, instead of just saying, what's the category, and instead of just sticking on that one feature, I'm going to actually describe a whole bunch of different things about a dog. And I'm going to teach my students to self-question in a way that's going to help them to describe a lot of things about that word, because our students with language disorders really struggle with that. And what happens is that we've got to pull the information out of them and we've got to ask them a million questions. They don't know how to retrieve that information themselves. So for example, we might guide them through asking them different questions like, what group does it go in? So there's your category. What does it do? And then you would describe things like function. So you could go category, function, and then you could do physical attributes like, how does it feel? What does it look like? That could be your next category, or that could be your next semantic feature that you describe. And then you go on to, where would you find it? So you move on to location. What things go with it? What parts does it have? All of those things. So you would move through that process. And instead of just drilling categories, you're working on categories within the context of describing that word, and you're doing all of that at once. Now, your students will need some visual aids. They will need some scaffolding throughout this process, and they're not going to be able to perfectly tell you all of those things right away. But the whole thing is that you want them to learn that the whole point of us learning how to group words together and use categories is so that we can describe words more vividly and understand them so that we can learn other words. So when you do it in this way, that allows it to be less rote drill. And what that allows you to do is make it a little bit more challenging for your students so that you can bridge that gap between those really structured activities and things that are more difficult. And then what you can do is that this activity actually sets the stage for the next activity that I typically teach, where we're actually describing word definitions, and that categorical information that you've talked about during your semantic feature analysis, we write that down, we remember it, and then we use that in our next activity so they know how to apply it. But if you're just sitting there and you're just doing the rote drill categorization and you're just stopping there, you're not necessarily helping your students make those connections. So while that first activity that I said is good for kind of a priming exercise at the very beginning of your lesson, like, group these words together into some categories, or let's just do some quick naming of, all right, here's a dog, that's an animal, here's a piece of corn, that's a food. Doing that at the beginning is good for priming, but you want to just make sure that you take that activity and don't stop there, that you do more description with your students. So I call that semantic feature analysis. It's in a lot of the literature with vocabulary, and it is one of the techniques that I teach under my 5-component framework for language therapy. It's actually one of the first components that I teach, which is semantics, which falls under that umbrella of vocabulary, which can really be one of those first steps in developing your framework and your system for language therapy for students who have those language and literacy issues. You can do this activity, you can really tailor it to your students' needs. So I've done it all the way down to kindergarten age, all the way up through high school age. So you can really tailor it to the vocabulary that's appropriate for those students. So same thing applies for the framework I teach. I have SLPs that are using it for kindergarten all the way through high school. So if you're interested, this is just the first piece of that framework. If you're interested in seeing the big picture and all of the components, again, we talked about semantics today. There's actually 5 components. Semantics is just the first one. If you're interested in learning all 5 components, what they are, why they work, I go through those in my online presentation for SLPs called the 5-component system for language therapy. I will share it in the comments below. I'll share the link. You can actually register for this online presentation. And there are usually several playing times every day that you can watch it. So thanks so much for listening, and check out that presentation to learn the rest of the framework so that you can start walking into your language therapy sessions confident that you are getting your students set up for success, and so that you can know that you are implementing a framework that's going to help your students make sustainable, consistent progress. Thanks so much for watching, and check out the presentation.